Let's talk about Requirement 12, which has the simplified name of an InfoSecurity policy. So it can be considered a compilation of every single one of the procedures and policies of the other requirements. So you may remember that sub-requirement at the end that says document and enforce these procedures for every single one of the other requirements, but it goes way beyond that. It's about setting clear responsibilities and clear owners. It's about screening your employees before they come on board and after they come on board, and it's about clarifying both at the management level and operational level what are the roles and responsibilities, as well as what are the acceptable uses of technology and what service providers can be used, among many other aspects. Let's take a look. Let's cover the last requirement of the PCI-DSS. Requirement 12 has the full name of Maintain a Policy that addresses information security for all personnel. And as the name says, it's about having an information security policy at all levels of the organization. This is probably the only requirement in the framework that is not technical but is about management. This is fully about policies, as the name says. It's also the requirement where all other policies come together. Do you remember that sub-requirement at the end of every requirement saying document and enforce these policies and procedures? Well, this is where all of those come together. So you may see direct references to other requirements here. For example, keep an inventory of all physical assets, which comes from requirement 9, or keep systems updated, which includes a bit from requirement 5, keeping the antivirus updated, or requirement 1, keeping the firewall updated, or requirement 11, keeping the IDS or IPS updated, and so on. It brings them all together, but it does go beyond it, and it sets even more policies and procedures. But anyway, let's cover it. And by the way, if you were expecting the last requirement to be a little lighter because we're approaching the end, well, I have bad news for you. This is the most extensive and longest requirement of them all. It covers the whole company, all of the people, and all of the processes related to card data. We have 11 sub-requirements this time, so the PCI-DSS framework really ends with a bang. Anyway, 12.1 is about establishing, publishing, maintaining, and disseminating this policy. It's about making sure that you do have this policy and that it reaches the people that must know about it. 12.2 is about having an annual risk assessment process. Every year, you must be aware of what threats and what vulnerabilities exist and plan for them. 12.3 is about developing usage policies. What technology can be used, by whom, and what are the acceptable uses. 12.4 is about having clear security responsibilities. This one is short. It's just saying, whatever it is, firewall, antivirus, etc., there must be an owner for it, period. 12.5 is about assigning said responsibilities. It's the flip side of this one. While 12.4 says that there must be an owner, 12.5 says that you have to identify the owner. 12.6 is about security awareness. In other words, your personnel must know how important information security is from the moment they're hired, non-negotiable. 12.7 is about screening potential personnel before hiring them. Don't let people into your organization without background checks, reference checks, or others. 12.8 is about your service providers, third parties that you contract with. You must have a process for their selection, a list of authorized providers, and you must obtain a confirmation from each that they will safeguard card data. And if they don't give it to you, something is wrong here. 12.9 is a direct segue to that point. If you are a service provider, you must provide this confirmation of safeguarding their card data to your clients in writing. 12.10 is about having an incident response plan. In case of a breach, what happens? not only having it, but testing it every year. Finally, 12.11 is in case you are a service provider. And in that case, just like the security testing, here you must review your security policies and procedures quarterly, and exactly for the same reasons as the other sub-requirements. Technology changes, attacks change, and your systems change. Let's start with 12.1. You need to establish, publish, maintain, and disseminate an information security policy. In other words, make the policy reach the people that it impacts and keep it updated. That's it. The policy must be disseminated to everyone that has roles that deal with cardholder data. In other words, people that are subject to these policies. They must be reviewed yearly, and for the same reasons as for other requirements. The business changes, the technology changes, suppliers change, which results in different types of threats, but also different possible protection techniques. 12.2 is about having an annual risk assessment process. This is inventorying new threats and vulnerabilities and repeating this process both yearly and on significant changes. And these vulnerabilities must be assessed in terms of risk levels. It's important to note that formal risk analysis results must be an output of this analysis. In other words, something tangible must come from it, otherwise you fail the requirement. And also, all critical assets in your card data environment, as well as the threats and the vulnerabilities, must all be identified. Otherwise, you can't properly assess the risks. In other words, you're asking yourself, what do I have that's important and what's weak about it? That's it. And you repeat this question every year with a tangible answer. Sub-requirement 12.3 is about developing usage policies. Who uses technological assets and how? First, management approval for adopting any type of critical technology, as well as having role-based access control by individual users to that technology. These are mandatory. All assets must be inventoried, as well as all authorized users per asset. And that includes, in specific, the owner of that asset. There must be an owner, not just for any given task, but also any given hard asset. Just to clarify, they don't need to be literally in the next room, but they need to be identified. What I mean is, if one of your firewalls is compromised, who is the owner of it? Because that person will probably be responsible for remedial actions, as well as in general keeping it updated and protected. These policies should also define acceptable uses of technology. For example, can you use a computer that stores cardholder information for sales calls by a sales representative, which may represent a lot of unsecured communication calls and on a large scale? Or can people use computers to go on social media or to watch pirated movies? This must be very clear. Also, there must be acceptable network locations and acceptable products. Maybe some protocols are just not accepted, or some vendors are blacklisted, but all of this must be on paper. Then, restrictive remote usage policies for third parties. This stems directly from requirement 7, need to know access. Third parties must have very specific logins that allow them to do very specific things and with very specific time durations. And then, naturally, prohibiting moving any cardholder data to local machines. In other words, an employee can't just copy credit card data to their work laptop to use as mock data to develop an app, for example, and take it home. Or if there are exceptions, there must be a very good reason for them. Then, 12.4 is very simple. Have clear security responsibilities for all personnel. So all responsibilities must be defined. The firewall admin has the responsibility to keep it updated, maybe to update the network documentation as well. Maybe there's an office security manager with the responsibility of safeguarding physical data or verifying visitor badges, and so on. Every person must have a responsibility, and this goes up the chain, up to the senior managers. There must be someone ultimately responsible for the information security policy, probably a CSO or Chief Security Officer, or a CISO or Chief Information Security Officer, or maybe some intersection with the Data Protection Officer or DPO, but there must be an owner of some sort. Then, 12.5 is about assigning set security responsibilities. This point includes having ultimately responsible personnel for specific tasks, which can include, for example, first, someone responsible for establishing and disseminating the actual policies, someone responsible for monitoring all user accounts, as well as all access to cardholder data, then someone responsible for monitoring all security logs and all alerts, or someone responsible for establishing incident response procedures and escalation procedures, as well as actually executing them. So this is a counterpart to the previous point. The previous point said that people must be responsible for something, and this point says that these specific activities must have an owner. They're two sides of the same coin. Then, 12.6 is about having a security awareness program in the company, making sure that all personnel knows the policies and procedures, both upon recruiting, which is the starting point, but also yearly due to changes in technology and procedures. So they have to be trained not just upon hiring, but also yearly, very much for the same reasons as for other requirements. And here's the thing, personnel must also confirm reception and understanding of security policies and procedures in a written format. They have to know what they're getting into, of sorts. Do you remember those terms of service that software forces you to accept so that you prove that you've consented to how it can be used? Well, this is the equivalent for security policies in the organization. They have to mark them as read and agreed. Then, 12.7 is screening potential personnel before hiring them. This is just running some checks to minimize the chances of an attack due to internal employee action, hiring the wrong person. It may include background checks, criminal record checks, reference checks, and others on every person you hire. Even better would be to do these checks regularly and not on hiring. Is it improbable that someone that you've already hired will become a criminal in the meantime? It is improbable. But is it impossible? It isn't. And if it happens, I bet you will want to know. Then 12.8, policies and procedures for service providers. This is because any service provider may compromise your card data in their services, whether you do hosting, physical storage, encryption of your data, or others. They are all potential weak links. So you must keep a list of all your service providers, as well as obtaining from each a written confirmation of their responsibility in safeguarding your card data. By the way, if they refuse to provide this, something is wrong. This is actually required for them to be compliant with the PCI-DSS. It's literally the next sub-requirement. Also, you must necessarily have a process to select the service providers themselves, as well as yearly monitoring of their PCI-DSS compliance. Again, you don't need to have a specific process, just use common sense. As mentioned, 12.9 is the flip side of the previous one. If you are a service provider, you must confirm to your customers in writing that you are responsible for safeguarding their cardholder data. It's literally that point of the previous sub-requirement, but from the point of view of the service provider and not the client. And the agreements may vary here, naturally, depending on the services provided. But what's important is that the agreement itself must be enforceable. It must be valid and binding, and both parties must agree with that. Then, sub-requirement 12.10, having an incident response plan. Look, in case of a breach, there must be a plan that dictates exactly what immediate actions will be taken. What happens if your firewall gets breached? What happens if your intrusion detection system gets triggered? What happens if your file integrity monitoring solution detects that a critical file has been changed? There must be immediate actions. And also, this plan must be reviewed yearly, for the same reasons as every other requirement of periodic updating. This incident response plan must include the roles, the responsibilities, the contact information of people, the recovery and continuity procedures, and possibly the backups. Also, there must be personnel available 24/7. And by the way, this is mandatory for you to be PCI-DSS compliant. It usually is a problem for smaller companies. Someone has to be available 24/7. In a large company, you can easily find someone. In a small company, it is harder, but it has to be done. You also need alerts from all types of systems, including your IDS or IPS, your firewall, your file integrity monitoring solution, your logging systems, your antivirus, and so on. And finally, changes to the incident response process, guess what? Must follow a change management process themselves. Someone can't just change one of the steps just because. Our final sub-requirement is 12.11, named Quarterly Service Provider Reviews. This is in case you are a service provider, and again, because any intrusion doesn't just make you vulnerable, but all of your clients vulnerable as well, you must review your security procedures and policies quarterly instead of yearly like other organizations. You also need additional controls to ensure that personnel are really following these. And this includes reviewing different components, including your logs, remember, critical logs daily, your firewall rules, your procedures for configuration standards, your incident response procedures, and your change management processes for every single system, and especially those that deal with changes in configurations, such as changes in user credentials, changes to firewall rules, changes in the intrusion detection system, and so on. What are some examples of this requirement? The first is that it's a kind of policy consolidation. As we mentioned, if you've noticed in the other requirements, that final sub-requirement saying document and enforce these procedures and policies, our old friend constantly popping up in every requirement, this is where they all come together. This requirement is not just the sum of the policies, but it is also the sum of the policies. Then, again, use common sense. Many of these policies, such as what's the acceptable use of technology or how frequently to run background checks, don't need specific procedures. They just have to show that you put some thought into it. What the assessor will be looking for is there a specific reason behind this number, or is it here just because? And if it's there just because, you fail compliance. And finally, if there is no agreement, there's a problem. In specific, I'm talking about that declaration from a service provider that they'll handle and safeguard your card data. It's required for them to provide this to be PCI-DSS compliant. So if they don't provide it, or if you don't provide it as a service provider, that means that something's wrong here. Maybe they're lying, maybe they lost their compliance status and they don't want to reveal it, or something else may be going on. But usually, it's not anything good. What are the key takeaways from requirement 12? The first two requirements are about the policy and risks. 12.1 is about establishing, maintaining, and disseminating the policies to everyone involved, while 12.2 is about doing yearly risk assessment and evaluation. Then, 12.3 is about usage policies. What technology can be used, for what purpose, what systems, and accessed by which roles. while 12.4 is about consolidating responsibilities. What does this person do? This person takes care of the firewall. This person takes care of the antivirus. And it goes all the way up to senior management. Then 12.5 is the flip side. It's about assigning those responsibilities. Who's responsible for reviewing all logs? Who's responsible for reviewing all user credential changes? And so on for every operation. 12.6 is about awareness, making sure that employees who are actually going to enact your security procedures are well trained in information security. Then, the following two are about screening. 12.7 is about screening personnel. 12.8 is about screening providers. 12.7 is about doing background checks, criminal record checks, and so on for the people you hire, while 12.8 is about having a process and specific criteria for selecting your third parties, or for dropping them, as well as obtaining agreements from them in terms of safeguarding your card data. Then 12.9 is if you are a service provider doing that yourself, providing that same agreement to your clients. I am responsible and will safeguard your card data. Then 12.10 is about incident response. There must be a protocol. It must include the key people, the key roles, their responsibilities, their contact information. There must be personnel available 24/7. There must be alerts from every critical system, and you must review this process yearly. And finally, 12.11 is, in case you are a service provider, review these procedures and policies quarterly. Remember, any vulnerability doesn't just affect you, it affects your clients as well. So you can't just review this yearly, you have to do it quarterly. You are under more scrutiny, if you will. So you must review how security protocols are being followed to firewall configurations, antivirus configurations, incident response procedures, change management for these, and others. Logs are even more frequent daily. So as we see, requirement number 12 is about having policies and procedures at all levels of the organization to really make sure that cardholder data is protected. Incident response, acceptable uses of technology, employee screening, risk assessment, and everything else that really contributes to creating a full spectrum information security policy that helps protect your card data environment. It's important to not only have clarified the roles and responsibilities and to disseminate these policies, but also make sure that there are owners at the end of the day for specific responsibilities.